There is a game to be played on Saturday in College Park, Maryland, against a 4-6 Maryland team that's been quite disappointing themselves, playing an Iowa team that is trying to avoid a 6-6 finish. But as Corey has outlined, regardless of the last two games, this has been one major disappointment for the Hawkeyes this year. But the two get together in the Big Ten Network at 11 Central. We've got Colin McNamara stopping by from Testudo Times on SB Nation to help us break it down. Colin, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Doing great. Thanks for stopping by to break down the Terps for us. Of course, the last time the Hawkeyes headed out there to College Park, they had a good time, 51-14. And that was on a Friday night. And here we are again. You may have heard my intro into this game that Maryland, obviously, with 3 consecutive bowl wins. Mike Locksley being asked that question every offseason when there were divisions about trying to reach Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and that was the hurdle. And now it's a completely different dynamic, but a major step backwards this year. So just one win in the conference. So your thoughts about where this program sits that had been on a slight ascension and now appears to have hit some adversity.
Yeah, just to kind of back things up. Locksley took over in 2019 when the program was probably at the depths it's ever been, rock bottom for them. And he's continued to build. I've been, kind of a Locksley defender over the past few years, just where he's been able to get this program back to. And, the 3 straight bowl wins, obviously coming with quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, the brother of Tua Tagovailoa, the quarterback for the Dolphins. And, now the all-time passing leader in the Big Ten. He's gone this year, which has led to Billy Edwards Jr. now stepping up. And through the first few games, he looked far from the problem. But now I think since October 11th, he has more interceptions than touchdowns. The team's just crumbling. Every season beforehand, Locksley talks about competing for Big Ten championships. And like you mentioned, this is just a massive step back. And I think it's also important to note that the one Big Ten win that they do have pretty much came off the hand of a blocked field goal. If USC hits that field goal with about 40 seconds left, I believe was in the game, or it was under 2 minutes. USC goes on to win that, and Maryland is winless in Big Ten play with only 3 wins coming as non-conference opponents who just simply aren't up to the stature of Maryland's program. So even that one bowl or that one conference win, it's you can kind of draw that up to luck. So this has just been an extremely disappointing season. And, now coming off the Rutgers loss, they've beaten Rutgers by 26 points on average over the last 3 years. They come and, get manhandled by Rutgers last weekend. So this is just kind of an all-time low for the program as far as last, 3 years go. And, there's just not a lot of confidence, energy, excitement around the program right now.
And now comes the time where Mark pauses and wants me to take over.
We'll trade off. I've got a few other questions for Colin.
Well, Colin, this is no disrespect to you at all. As I led out here, first of all, I'm guessing you're of no kin to Cade McNamara. We've got to get that out of the way because people will resent you for the rest of your time with SB Nation if you admit that. So even if you are, don't admit it. But I want to make something very clear. I thought it was interesting today. He brought up Michael Locksley and kind of being a defender of Michael Locksley. And I will admit, Michael Locksley's tenure at Maryland, Mark, I think you and I have had discussions about that. I think it's been more successful than some people anticipated it would be, given what his head coaching record was prior to Maryland. Now, I will say this is interesting, and Colin, I don't expect you to comment on this, but Mark, you listened to Kirk Ferentz's press conference today, and we all know the Brian Ferentz storylines. That's one thing we haven't brought up. He's obviously an analyst in the staff now, so there's that storyline. Now, he's talking about sidelines on Saturday, so I think that storyline's going to be a little bit overhyped. But what I think is interesting is whenever Kirk is asked about Michael Locksley and he talks about how much respect he has for Michael Locksley, that's such maybe we shouldn't be talking about this, but it's such a deviation from the norm, given some of the scandalous things that Michael Locksley was involved with at New Mexico. Now, the only thing I can piece together, and Mark, you help me on this, the only thing I can piece together is that some of the scandalous stuff at Michael Locksley involved his son. At New Mexico. So maybe there's the connection there. They've both been embattled with bloodline type of scandals, but he was accused of punching an assistant coach. He had a sexual assault scandal and lawsuit at one point. I was surprised, but at the same time, he has given Brian a job. So there's that. I don't know. Just a random thought that I wanted to bring up. I guess the big thing for you, Colin, that I'm curious about, Mark brought up, what was it? I'm losing track of years. 3 years ago, the trip out to College Park on a Friday night, and a couple of undefeated teams. That was early in the season, and Iowa eventually ascended up into the top 5 before plummeting out. And that game, it was a Friday night on Fox, and obviously Maryland played horribly, turned the ball over 7 times, but there was so much excitement around the game. And yet I remember looking at the crowd that night and being like, why are there not more excited fans? It felt like a bad crowd given the circumstances, because it was a really good start for that year for Maryland. So what kind of fan base is going to be there this weekend for a team that's on life support for bowl eligibility?
Yeah, it's been a constant talking point among Maryland fans. Even, head coach Mike Locksley, talks about in his press sprint every week, kind of pleading the fans to come out. And I actually asked him today in his media availability is, Maryland men's basketball played Marquette on Friday, number 15 Marquette, and the environment was just great. It was so refreshing covering football all season to go to a basketball game where the fans are on their feet cheering for every defensive stop, every single point. There was a loud eruption from the crowd. And I asked him, I was like, what's it going to take to get that kind of environment and energy into the shell, which is, what we call Siku Stadium. And he's just, typical kind of PR answer, like, oh, I've loved, the fan base here so far this year. I think they've really stuck through us through a difficult season. But, that's just, I'm expecting probably as bad as the crowd has been all year, maybe over the last 3 years. The fan base, I really don't know what it is. Maybe it's because there's a lot to do in the Maryland, D.C. area that kind of distracts people away from the football program. And, given just kind of the history of the football program, not necessarily known for being a national powerhouse, obviously by any means, doesn't really naturally spark excitement. There's not really much of a culture, I think, within the fan base. And even the fans that do come, the student section is usually pretty packed, at the start of the game. But then by halftime, whether they're winning or losing, the students usually leave to go to the bars, do whatever. That's just the trend of what happens here. If you look back at last year, they started 5-0 for the first time since 2001. They beat Indiana, who obviously Indiana is a great team now. Very different team last year. But they started 5-0. They beat Indiana 44-17, I believe. They were up through the entire game. Fans still left at halftime. Fans are leaving. When they beat USC, this is a big game for the program this year. The fans stormed the field, but it was like a couple thousand maybe stormed the field. It was like the most uninspiring field storming you've probably ever seen in your entire life. It's just kind of been the constant thread. And on our podcast, the Testudo Talk podcast, I kind of went on a little bit of a rant about this after the Rutgers game, just kind of calling out the fans, because it doesn't matter really what position this program is in, who they bring in, what the talent they have there. They've had Stephon Diggs, they've had DJ Moore, they've had all these high level people. They have Talia Tagovailoa, the Big Ten's all-time leading passer, and the fans still don't show up. So to get back to your question on what the environment's going to be like, probably the worst it's been all year. It's usually an embarrassment whenever we had a national television game and they pan to the crowd and it's like 50% of the stadium's empty. They have the upper bowl on the opposing sideline that's always empty. It's as a student that goes here, it's just sad to watch. Honestly, I'm very, very disappointed in the fan base year in and year out, and it's the same this year, and it's probably going to be the worst it's been against Iowa.
Now, I will say this is a quarterback storyline that's somewhat intriguing, because you have a first-year starter in Billy Edwards. You have a situation at Iowa where we don't even know who the starter is going to be. It could be any of 3 guys. Heck, by Saturday, it may be Mark. We don't know. And so I think that's obviously fascinating. But tell people what can they expect from Billy Edwards, because the numbers say he's been pretty good in spite of their struggles. And I would think both of these teams that Iowa plays here down the stretch, Maryland and Nebraska, there's got to be a sense of urgency. If there's not a sense of urgency, then I think Michael Locksley's lost his guys. And is Mark led with, hey, they've won 3 straight bowl games? I wouldn't think. It doesn't seem like, it seems like, just from my recollection, without studying each year, during Michael Locksley's tenure at Maryland, they have this roller coaster where they start hot in September, then they dip way down, and then they kind of recover at least enough to make a bowl game, and then they perform pretty well in December. So are we going to see that again? Because they're going to have to win these last 2 games, which means going to be a sense of urgency this weekend.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of the big shtick is like the September Terps is always a thing where they go undefeated in September and then things kind of fizzle out from there. But yeah, I mean, Loxley was saying there's no pressure. Obviously, that's what the coach is going to say. 1-game seasons, whatever. But yeah, they have to win these next 2 games for bowl eligibility. Iowa's a big task at hand as it is, but then they go and play number 4 Penn State on the road the following weekend. So yeah, I guess there has to be a sense of urgency. But something that I've noticed that's weird and maybe a little bit frustrating as a fan is on the sidelines when they're getting blown out by Minnesota, by Northwestern, you see the players kind of laughing and joking around the sidelines, which I've seen fans kind of point out in our comment sections, and I've even seen on TV myself. It's definitely frustrating for Maryland fans. I don't know specifically if Loxley's lost the locker room. I know the players love Loxley. He's been a fairly good recruiter since he's been here. But yeah, but to get back to your original point on what to expect from Billy Edwards, this is, he was the backup to Talia the last 2 years. He's waited his turn. And he was a guy he scored 7 rushing touchdowns last year. He led the team just based on like the tush push. Obviously that was kind of sweeping the nation with the Philadelphia Eagles, and Billy Edwards being kind of a bigger stature guy was used. And this year they haven't really used him that much in the running game, which I know fans have been frustrated, but Loxley, as most coaches do, want to protect, his quarterback. But he's been on a steady decline. I predicted early in the season that our backup quarterback, MJ Morris, would actually come in for him. I thought, just based on what we've seen through the bowl game last year and just the rare starts that Billy would get over the last 2 years, he just isn't an accurate quarterback. And, through the first half of the year, he was pretty fine. He was actually a bright spot for this team. But over the last few games, he's shown that his inaccuracy has been a big issue. He's missed Ty Felton in the first quarter against Rutgers on a wide open post route that would have been a touchdown. He missed Caden Prather on another touchdown later in the third quarter, I believe. This is a guy who, started hot and has just fizzled out. And that kind of leads to the conversation that has been going on around the program with Malik Washington coming in, who's the number 5 ranked quarterback in the country by 247 Sports. He's going to come in next year as a true freshman. And, who will start Edwards or, Washington is kind of up for debate. But, Billy Edwards is somebody that, again, the numbers look good, but they're also inflated because Maryland has been losing a lot of these games. They're forced to pass. Last week against Rutgers, he had 330 yards. I believe 180 of them came in the fourth quarter when they're losing by 2 scores. Maryland was outpassed the first 3 quarters, but then in the fourth quarter, they end up, outpassing them by 150 yards, and all of a sudden it looks better on paper. So the stats may look good, but Billy Edwards has not been very good over the last few games.
What's concerning to me as well, when I look at this from a defensive standpoint, is you got Maryland statistically as the worst pass defense in the conference for a team that you just brought up gets behind early. So one would think teams don't have to pass it very much.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's that. And then obviously they're the 3rd worst total defense in the conference. And like you said, they pass the ball a lot. They're forced to pass a lot. Now, Billy Edwards' completion percentage, when I checked it earlier, is still sitting like 65% for the season. Now, I don't know, again, how much of that is teams kind of let them dink and dunk and take what's in front of them. And, they've built a lead early. But Mark, do you have anything specific that I'm not hitting on?
Well, basically, yeah, this is an odd program to nail down because they've been in the Big Ten now going back to 2014. As Colin outlined, Mike Loxley did a better job than I anticipated. I would not have hired him, but he proved me wrong, at least in the interim. 3 consecutive bowl wins, not ever being able to break through. I actually asked him at Big Ten Media Days, that with all the position players, the skill position players, Colin, that you mentioned, Raheem Jarrett in recent years and so forth and so on, the guys that they've had, when are they going to develop the kind of play along the offensive and defensive fronts that are going to challenge? And Loxley, of course, gave the pat answer that he thought that this year's team had what it took to do that. So my thought here is that I know it's only one bad season, but depending on what the expectations are, not from us necessarily, but the administration, at what point does he, and again, I don't expect it to be this season, but does this set up Mike Loxley for a hot seat season in 2025?
Yeah, this has definitely been a conversation going on throughout throughout at least the media and the fan base. A lot of maybe overreacting fans want him fired, but at the end of the day, he's going to stay at least another year, guaranteed, because we have Malik Washington coming in, which is obviously probably the biggest recruit Maryland has had under Loxley. Getting the fifth ranked quarterback in the nation is obviously a huge deal for this program. So he's not going to be fired this year, absolutely not. And just based on history, Maryland had Dwayne Haskins coming in to the program. They had him committed to Maryland, but then they fired their head coach and he flips to Ohio State. They're not going to risk another situation like that. And Loxley has kind of proved over the last 3 years that he at least deserves another shot. But yeah, absolutely, the hot seat is on. If he has another season like this last year or next year, another 3, 4, or 5-win season where he's not making another bowl game, I absolutely believe that kind of the hot seat will be on. But also you have to keep a perspective where Maryland isn't these teams where Iowa is getting 8 to 10 wins. That's kind of the expectation every year, or Penn State or Ohio State or Michigan. These teams that kind of expect this, Maryland hasn't been a historically great football program. So I think fans maybe need to temper their expectations a little bit on how far the means of this program can go, as far as, especially with NIL funding being such a huge issue. Loxley can only do so much with what he has. And I think he's done a relatively good job to at least have, 2 more years left, as the head coach of Maryland.
Colin McNamara here from Testudo Times, everyone. And of course, while the football season's only probably 2 games left for this Maryland football team, staring at an underdog situation against Iowa and then more so against Penn State, of course, lock it in for the basketball season that has started up. So again, Colin McNamara with Testudo Times.
And Colin, is women's basketball as big as football?
Oof. People love women's basketball here. It is not, but women's basketball, it's probably the only consistently big program that Maryland has. And they're off to a great start this year. So people are excited about women's basketball. People are always excited about women's basketball.
Because it's never the men's program hasn't fully recovered from the previous regime. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Willard showed some signs in his first year, but last year was obviously a big hit, and this year, we'll just kind of have to see what they do this year.
Big Ten's loaded in the women's game, Mark.
Okay.
Big Ten. Let me repeat it.
Big
Ten is loaded in the women's game, Mark. And the 3 of the 4 West, unlike football, in which you have, every team but Oregon that's kind of been crummy to some extent this year. Oregon is a power in the women's game. USC and UCLA are both. There's like 7 or 8 teams in the top 25 as of this week, and several teams just on the outside looking in. So
every team in Big Ten football is crummy.
No, I said every team but Oregon. Okay. What I meant was the 4 teams that were added from the West Coast.
Oh, okay.
USC, UCLA, and Washington have in large part been disappointments. I mean, Washington's been fine based on what our expectations were. And frankly, UCLA's been okay. I have no room to say anything. By the way, one more note for people. Maryland is worst in the Big Ten. I shouldn't say that. Second to worst in the Big Ten in penalty yardage. Only behind UCLA. So Iowa just played them, and there'll be another penalty-ridden team this weekend on the road. So,
hey, Colin, thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it, and enjoy the game this weekend.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Thanks for having me.